four different studies of the impacts of a personalized edtech solution, particularly 1Billion's One Course solution on foundational numeracy. And the presenters come from two main organizations, Imagine Worldwide and the University of Nottingham. So we're very excited to have you all join us. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about what the intervention is about, what the software is about. We have at least two of the developers of the software in our group. So I hope I get this all right. You'll let me know if I don't, but these studies were all using 1Billion's One Course for mathematics. And we all used the original software in these studies. And in particular, the software covered early maths material, typically standards 1 and 2 material. It's self-paced. Children can proceed at their own pace through the software. There is direct teaching with Anna, who is an avatar who talks and demonstrates. And you can see Anna pointing over here on the right-hand side. And there is, unlike a lot of maths software, there's no reliance on reading in the maths instruction. So children do not have to be literate to use the maths app. Children use headphones to maintain a quiet environment. And the versions that we were all using here, half of us were using was on the iPads, and I guess the X Prize was on an Android device. We'll talk more about that. You may know that 1Billion was a co-winner of the X Prize for Global Learning. And since then, they have been working on new software, which adds curriculum to what we used here, has adaptive features, and is also available widely on Android devices. So there has been development since the software versions that we used in these studies. And briefly, here's a visual, simple version of the theory of change, which is that the child using the tablet as a personalized curriculum is at the center of the theory of change. And everything around that is the enabling environment, including the offline curriculum, the tablets that are battery powered, often through solar powered batteries. The research-based curriculum is very engaging. It includes typically both reading and maths instruction. We focus here on the maths curriculum. It's offline, and adults in this instance play facilitative roles. They help to ensure a safe environment and an environment that is conducive to learning, quiet and productive environment. But the child using the tablet at their own pace is at the center of the theory of change. And now we're going to begin the first of 4 studies, summaries of the first of 4 studies, and then we will open it up to discussion at the end. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Antonie Chigeda.
Thank you, Karen. The first study that we're sharing with you is on the impact of tablet use on learning retention. And this is coming from experiences we had in Malawi during the COVID-19 pandemic. This study was part of an ongoing RCT that we were trying to assess the impact of a standard instruction and literacy and numeracy outcomes of using 1Billion's One Course software. So in Malawi, this is delivered in the local language, which is Chigeda. And so the apps were actually running in that particular language. The focus of this study, we were interested in understanding subgroup characteristics such as school, gender, and age category, and how these are associated with learning outcomes as children use the tablets. And we also wanted to understand what impact does attendance in the intervention have on the learning outcomes overall? And lastly, we're interested to understand how far the children would actually go in terms of reading fluency with comprehension and comparable numeracy skills, looking at arithmetic fluency with number sense. So these were the questions that we're looking in the main study. And this study was planned to run from October 2019 to July 2021. So in Malawi, this would be equal to 2 academic years or 16 months of the intervention. And so within this broader study, we designed to do a midline, and that midline is what I'm reporting in this presentation. Next slide. So the big study, or the main RCT, had a total of 600 learners who came from 2 public primary schools in Malawi. In these 2 schools, there were tablet lessons that were being delivered to standard 2 or grade 2 learners, both in literacy and numeracy. So we baselined all the participants in 2019 using the early grade reading assessment and the early grade mathematics assessments. And after that, the learners or the participants, we worked out the baseline equivalents and assigned them to 3 treatment groups. So there were 200 in each arm. So one group was doing literacy, the other group was doing numeracy, and then we had the other group as control. Next slide. So as Karen pointed out, we're working using one course, that's a software by 1 billion. In this one course, we have a total of 3,140 units in literacy, and the math app has about 843 units at the time when we actually worked with these. And so children worked individually on a tablet at their own pace each day for about 40 minutes for each day of the week. And usually an adult facilitator was present during the tablet lessons, and their primary role was to support the children in case they have any challenges, either with the technology or any other aspects of what they were using. But the children had to work on the particular assignments or activities on the tablets unaided. In addition to the intervention, the group was also receiving regular classroom instruction from their teachers in literacy as well as in the other subjects on the curriculum. For the control group, these learners did not participate in the tablet sessions. They only worked on or received instruction from their teachers in their regular classrooms. Next slide. So during the period when this study is coming after, we had rising cases of COVID in around March 2020, and schools were forced to close down. And this was basically after 5 months since we started the main study. And so schools remained closed for a period of 7 months. And the standard 2 learners who were the target of our intervention only resumed lessons in mid-October 2020. And when we checked when children came back to school, about 84% of the learners returned. And these were assessed at midline using the same tests of EGRA and EGMA. And the purpose of the midline was to assess or to examine any impacts tablet usage may have had on the overall learning among the standard 2 learners after the 7 months break. Next slide. The results that we got from there indicated that the intervention group, those that were using the tablets, actually outperformed the children who did not use the tablets. Both groups had some retention of the learning prior, but the intervention group actually showed significant gains beyond what we saw with the control group. So like in early math skills or early literacy skills, the effect sizes was 0.37 for literacy and 0.35 for math. And overall, we had about 0.24 effect size for literacy and 0.35 for the math. So overall, what this indicated was that for the children who were using the intervention, they actually had better retention at the end of the 7 months break. Next slide. So looking at these results, the implications that we draw from this is that the intervention group performance compared to the control group indicate a positive impact on learning retention from that group that was using the tablets. And trying to explain why this was the case, we note that the variation in the content that was available through the tablets, the child-friendly pedagogies that have been used in the software, as well as the colorful illustrations, these increase the child's motivation and engagement with the lesson content. And so this increased engagement and motivation to learn may help increase the child's learning retention, as was the case in this study. But we're also mindful that retention was also affected by the child's regular attendance of the intervention. So children that attended more did better than those who attended less. The main study is continuing up to the end of this year, and we expect to do a final assessment around December to conclude the main study. This is what we learned from that piece of study, and now we'll transit to the next study. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. And please take note of any of your questions, and we'll take questions at the end. And we'll also be discussing cross lessons learned from the different studies. So I'm going to talk about a different RCT that we did in Malawi in a refugee camp, the Dzaleka refugee camp in Malawi. And here our particular question was, using the Maths app, the 1 billion Maths apps in English, would children whose first language was not English still benefit? And as I mentioned, this was in the Dzaleka refugee camp in Malawi, which serves primarily Congolese refugees who typically speak Swahili at home. But there was a strong community preference for language of instruction in the camp to be in English. We offered the software either in Swahili or in English. There was a strong community preference for English. All of the schools in the camp, formal and informal schools, teach in English. And there's a strong sense among the refugee community that English is the language of the future for their children. So we ended up delivering the maths instruction in English. The children who participated were enrolled in 4 grades, preschool 3, the oldest preschool group, through grade 3. And they were enrolled at an informal school in the camp, a community supported school. Ultimately, we enrolled 317 children in the RCT, also beginning in October 2019, which is when we launched the 2-year study that Tony was telling you about. We originally expected there to be more children enrolled in the school, over 400, but there had been some hardships in the camp and school enrollment was down. So we ran this as a proof of concept RCT. That means that we were expecting to be able to produce valid estimates of impact, but we were not expecting statistically significant results necessarily because we had a smaller sample size than originally planned. The maths program ran for 20 minutes per school day for 5 months. That is what the school was able to fit into their schedule. And we baselined and endlined using EGRA and EGMA, as with the study that Tony was describing. So to clarify, our primary research questions in this case, so we wanted to understand whether refugee children whose first language was not English could make learning gains using a mathematics software in English. Now they were in they were in school where the language of instruction was English. So they were getting English support through their regular school, but they were not primary English speakers. So our first question was, what are the impacts over standard instruction on math outcomes? The children were attending the informal school and they would, in addition, had 20 minutes a day on the math software. Were there any impacts of using the math software on literacy outcomes? And what impact did attendance have on learning outcomes. We had a few other questions, but we're going to focus in this presentation on those 3 impact questions. So the results after 5 months, 88% of the learners in both the treatment and control groups persisted in the study. And we met baseline equivalence standards for the treatment and control comparison. We ultimately had 278 learners in the final analytic sample. The Learning Center was open a total of 82 days, and on average, the learners attended 70% of the days that the Learning Center was open. That means that on average, the learners accumulated about 19 hours only of time on task between mid-October and mid-March when we concluded this study. Luckily, we had planned to conclude this study just before all schools in Malawi were closed down due to COVID. So we were able to complete the study as planned. So what did we learn? So effect sizes are, we're presenting here effect sizes. On the left-hand side are the effect sizes for our primary math outcome, which we use the pattern completion subtest of the EGMA test, the early grade math assessment. This pattern completion subtest is used as a benchmark, for benchmarking mathematics outcomes in the country of Malawi. So on the left-hand side, we have effect sizes for in maths. And on the right-hand side, we have effect sizes in literacy of using the maths instruction. So on the left-hand side, the blue, in both cases, the blue represents the intent to treat impacts, and the orange represents the treatment on the treated. And what does that mean? The blue represents all of the children enrolled in the treatment group compared with the control group, regardless of how much they attended or didn't attend. The entire group of treatment children compared with the control group. The orange, the treatment on the treated, restricts the treatment group to the children who attended at least half of the time. At least 50% of the time the program was available. And then these children are compared with everybody else. Anyone who, all the children who did not attend at least that much, including the control group and some of the treatment group who did not attend that much. To our surprise, results were statistically significant despite us having a much smaller sample size than we anticipated. On the left-hand side, the math outcomes, we see sizable effect sizes in maths for the treatment on the treated in blue, and for those who attended at least 50% of the time, an effect size of 0.50. In addition, we see a positive effect sizes suggested in literacy. And I'll talk about this in a moment. So key takeaways before I pass on to my colleague. Impacts of there were 3 impacts we were looking for. Yes, to the first question. Children whose first language was not English appear to have benefited significantly from the math software delivered in English. They gained meaningfully more in maths than did the control group. And the findings suggest that the math software may also have had positive effects in literacy, possibly by improving children's understanding of the English language because the software was delivered in English. And attending at least 50% of the time resulted in even greater impacts in both math and literacy. So those were our takeaways from the refugee camp study. So I'm going to pass on to Nikki.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And I think what I'm going to show you today is results from a multi-country study, or 2 multi-country studies, working with the 1 billion maths apps. And this is the very original form of the maths apps by 1 billion. that have led to the development of one course. I'm going to show you results that look very similar to the results that have been shown already by Antonie and by Karen. And I'd like you to hold that in your mind, their findings, as I show you these findings. Because this study was conducted to see if app-based maths instruction could offer a global solution to children learning foundational numeracy skills in different countries of the world. And the reason we were interested in looking at this is because of the features that Karen has already described about this EdTech intervention. So it's one-to-one with a tablet to a child, and you've got that inbuilt teacher, that avatar Anna, giving instructions to the child in their language of instruction. So we deployed the numeracy app by 1 billion in 5 different countries, varying in gross national income per capita, because we were interested to see whether the development status of the country was predictive in any way of the learning obtained with this technology. In each country, the app content was the same, but the language of instruction varied across countries. And in each country, it was a school-based implementation. The per country that we studied, the research design was the same. So we had around 300 early grade learners who were allocated to the study. They were given a baseline assessment with EGMA before the intervention, and then they experienced around 12 weeks of intervention. Half of the children received the 1 billion numeracy app instruction, and half of the children received instruction in standard classroom instruction for their numeracy lessons. And then at the end of that 12-week intervention period, we gave an endline assessment with EGMA that enabled us to look at learning gains over time. Next slide, please. So what I've shown here are the results that we gained mapped against gross national income per capita. And this was based on 2016 data from the World Bank. So I've reported the between group effect size. So that's the same as Tony and Karen have reported already. It's the difference in learning at endline and baseline between the intervention group and the control group. And what you can see are very similar effect sizes to those shown by Antonie and by Karen already. So in the country that had the lowest gross national income per capita, which is Malawi, we replicated the effect size that you've seen by Tony already with an effect size of 0.35. Whereas the country that had the highest gross national income per capita, the UK, we achieved an effect size of 0.24, and that's been replicated by different groups over different studies. We do show that South Africa had a much lower effect size of 0.15. It was still a positive effect for the intervention, but it was lower than we had seen in other countries. And that was because we had problems with implementation. Karen and Tony have already alluded to the fact that the amount of time that children interact with this technology impacts on the learning gains that were observed. And we see there that other aspects of implementation, including time on task, are affecting the impact that we saw in South Africa. And we know from a UK study that implementation fidelity has accounted for 41% of the variance that we saw in a UK study. So we know that implementation fidelity impacts effect sizes. But overall, these data suggest that this technology has the potential to scale globally to support learners in different countries and different contexts to learn basic numeracy skills. Next slide, please. One of the other multi-country studies I wanted to report today shows another factor that influences effect sizes, and that's language. So we were interested in the language in the apps because it's a very language-rich environment. You've got Anna, the avatar, talking to the child, explaining to them how to do things, and then giving instructions to the child as well. And we showed across 3 studies, one in Brazil, one in the UK, and one in Malawi, that the proficiency of the children in terms of their spoken language correlated with the amount of learning that we saw with the technology. So with bilingual children in Brazil, whether they were given the app in Brazilian Portuguese or English didn't matter. They showed similar effect sizes in terms of learning gains compared to controls, but we showed that language proficiency in the language of instruction correlated positively with progress through the app. For very young children in the UK, 3 to 4-year-olds using this technology, we showed that receptive vocabulary at baseline predicted maths learning outcomes at endline. And for children with special educational needs and disabilities in Malawi, we showed that children who had language difficulties, their progress was associated with slow progress compared to children without language difficulties, but say with motoric difficulties and other disabilities. So this is starting to show that language is an important factor that impacts learning, and we've shown implementation fidelity is as well. Karen and Tony have shown that time on task impacts learning with this technology. So our next steps are to determine other factors that impact on learning with this type of technology by different learners in different contexts. And our next speaker, Beth, is going to talk more about that. Thank you.
Thank you. So like Nicola said, I'm going to be talking a little bit differently about the contextual factors of implementing interventions such as one course into these settings. So my research is based on the Global Learning XPRIZE competition, which, as many of you know, was a 15-month field test with 5 different learning apps on handheld tablets. One of the 5 apps used was one course, used for both maths and reading in this instance, with 1 billion actually becoming one of the 2 winners of the prize. XPRIZE tested 2,700 children from 172 remote villages in Tanzania to see if they could learn literacy and numeracy skills in out-of-school settings using independent learning, and RTI independently measured the results from the 5 apps. And all apps provided significant improvements in maths, reading and writing skills. However, we knew very little about what actually happened on the ground during the field test. So I conducted an expert elicitation interviewing 14 key individuals to the competition. Interviewees included finalists, team leaders, key staff at XPRIZE and the lead judge of the competition. They were interviewed to explore the contextual factors that could have influenced the children's ability to learn in such remote communities, and they were questioned on the perceived challenges and successes and what the future of EdTech could be in these settings. 4 main themes were generated after conducting a thematic analysis on this data. So I'm going to talk them through while presenting some example quotes on the screen. Next slide, please. So the first theme is the idea of technology as a novel concept, which is the idea that the children had different levels of social connectivity prior to the competition. So the theme has 2 sub-themes. The first is wariness of something new. So due to low levels of previous exposure in the more remote villages, some children had never seen this kind of technology before and were understandably confused by it, breaking open the tablets to try and see where the voice was coming from. There was also reports of some villagers being suspicious of using them at first, as some thought they were spying on them or that the tablets were a form of witchcraft. And then the second sub-theme is still the idea of tech being novel, but in instances where the novelty spurred children on to use the tablets and be excited to play with them. So it'd be interesting to see if once the novelty has worn off, if it does wear off, if this would lead to reduced use in the tablets, or if the use would be sustained, because research has shown that sustained use in marginalised communities is difficult to achieve. Next slide, please. Sorry. The second theme generated was the idea that children don't learn in a vacuum, which is opposing the idea that children can learn completely independently. So most of the interviewees emphasised that despite the global learning competition presenting the idea of this fully independent learning, it wasn't feasible or truly realistic. So the first sub-theme is that it takes a village to raise a child. This is about the fact that interviewees report whole communities coming together to help the children, including parents, siblings, peers, and other adults within the village. There was also an individual appointed to be a village mama by X Prize in each community, who was paid to look after the practical elements of the competition and report any technical issues. But they began to proactively support the children through the process with encouragement and simple problem solving throughout. And then the other side of the children not learning completely independently is that there was the simulation of the teacher role using an in-app avatar. So these attempted to fill the gap for out-of-school children by providing guidance, personalised scaffolding and feedback. And some teams in the competition thought that freedom was best for the children, but the general consensus following the competition was that some level of direction is needed to stop the children losing interest or getting distracted and repeating games over and over again, rather than learning effectively by what's going to challenge them. Next slide, please. So the third theme is about knowing and respecting the cultural context of the area in which the intervention or app would be implemented. So this was deemed crucial to avoid failure and encourage sustained use. Teams often did not necessarily have extended knowledge of African communities, and as a result ended up including games that involved elements that African children had no experience of or that held negative connotations, as shown by the quotes on screen. However, previous research is conflicting, because some research says that you need to align with what children know to develop the interest, but then children have also been shown to enjoy and learn with made up elements or things that they have no personal experience of, such as unicorns, space travel, dinosaurs, things like that. Next slide, please. And the fourth and final theme is accessibility problems in a mobile world. Interviewees stress the importance of accessible and well-made infrastructure to improve the safety of the children and their families and make them more likely to use facilities. X Prize constructed charging stations for the communities to charge their tablets, but some children were walking up to 5 miles to charge, which is obviously dangerous and also quite laborious. So one particularly extreme story that I was told during the interviews is that there was a village where the children had to go through an elephant area to get to the state charging station. And in the past, people had been killed by the elephants. So these children were very reluctant to go to the charging station because they were afraid of the elephants. Obviously an extreme example, but just to sort of give you an idea of some of the barriers. Issues with accessibility also made it more complicated to collect experimental data throughout the process, and it would make it harder to access repairs for the tablets long term if they break unless provided with these facilities locally. Next slide, please. So ultimately, this research was a unique opportunity to gain critical insight into a large-scale EdTech intervention in Tanzania. And the general findings do largely reflect previous research in the sense of the novelty of technology does provide challenges, but also excitement and interest for the children. Infrastructure will always remain a fundamental challenge and barrier to overcome, and support systems and peers are crucial to success. While the Global Learning X Prize was clearly a huge success and a provider of greatly valuable research for future interventions, there's still big challenges to address. And something to consider is, if this level of intervention is not feasible independently, could it be beneficial as a teaching aid for understaffed teachers with large classes? A potential limitation during this research was because I was working in collaboration with X Prize, not not for XPRIs, but in collaboration with, the interviewees may not have been completely open and honest if they were unhappy with elements of the competition, or they could be so invested that they want to portray it purely positively, or there could have been the opposite effect and they'd be willing to speak to me more freely because I'm also considered to be an insider. So there is that to consider. It'd definitely be good to speak to people in the villages themselves and the children in the future to get a true insider perspective. And this research isn't yet finished, but the desired impact is to identify elements of best practice, because it's a big intervention to learn from, guide implementation fidelity for future educational apps, which are crucial points to try and improve and address this global learning crisis and allow more children access to materials that give them an opportunity to learn, and also inform theories about learning with mobile digital technologies. And I think now Karen is going to summarise the 4 studies for us.
Yes, and thank you. And sorry, my computer has a life of its own. The slides keep jumping forward, so I apologize for any confusion. But just a few multi-study conclusions, a few conclusions across these different studies. We have seen consistent positive impacts in both maths and literacy across contexts, including government schools, refugee settings, multiple languages in varied countries, and when children were using the software in their mother tongue or in a second language. So we believe that there is potential to scale globally, but as always, context and implementation matter. So a very brief summary. And now we want to open up to give everyone a chance to ask us questions. I would love to take questions from the audience. And then depending if we have time remaining, I'll ask my colleagues what recommendations they would make to move forward and how they feel that these results contribute to potentially a global solution. But I'm going to stop sharing, and we would love to hear from the audience, from everyone who is here, what your questions may be. So I'll go back and look at the chat. I haven't seen any questions. Are there no questions? Or are people being shy? Andrew,
Karen,
you have a question.
Yeah, perhaps I could ask a question. I mean, I think it may be in what you're about to come on to, but if you and your team could choose 1 or 2 things to really focus on to improve outcomes, do you have anything that's right at the top of your wish list to bring a bigger impact for the child? I mean, maybe I'm anticipating your next thoughts, but over to you. It'd be fascinating to know your view.
Well, first, I'll open it up to my colleagues. Nikki, Beth, Tony, how would you respond to Andrew's question?
I think for me, I would focus on supporting children's language acquisition, because we know it's important for both literacy and numeracy. So it should impact on both of the core skills that you're working in with one course. I think there are ways in which the language in the app could be simplified in some cases, but also I see the teachers and caregivers taking on a facilitative role in supporting language and children's language comprehension through the app. If we were to prep children for working with this technology, I would focus on their language skills. And I think that there are other contextual things that could happen in the software to support children. So when there's repeated instructions, they're not given exactly the same instruction, they're perhaps given that instruction in a slightly different way. and maybe using gestures and things like that to aid understanding. So that would be my top one at the moment.
I'll just piggyback on that for a moment, and just it's important to note in the refugee camp study where they were English as a second language learners, English as an additional language learners. They were getting support for English through the regular schooling. So it's not that the children were just using the tablets out of the blue in English without any other support in language. And I would say that what we don't really know is if children had little to no support in the language of instruction, what that would have occurred. So it's important to note they had support in English. Beth or Tony, did you want to respond? And then we can move on to some other questions.
I was just going to say, from the app specifically, doing the thematic analysis that I did, I think it's quite clearly that the children aren't learning alone, as we've all spoken about. But I think nurturing that in the app and actually creating more interactive, I'm not sure how possible or feasible it would be, but things that get the carers and the parents involved as well, so that it's more of a given that they will involve people rather than they go to them because they feel like they want support or need the support. I think that would be quite nice to sort of nurture the sort of family environment as well, because a lot of the parents don't necessarily know, have strong literacy or numeracy skills as well. So it could be an activity that is nurtured within the family, which would be quite nice.
Yeah, maybe just one small thing would be that in addition to what has been said already, we also have children who have special education needs. We know that those with extreme needs perhaps may not be well served with the tablets, like those who are completely unable to see or cannot hear. But in between, there are many other challenges that the learners have, maybe not perfect vision and all that. So I was just thinking that maybe one area that could also be looked at is improving the whole outlook of the different activities children are doing on the tablet, the font, the graphics, to capture a wide range of children who may have other challenges that perhaps in the school systems are not defined as challenges with education, but we do know the challenges as well.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience before I move to a set of prepared questions? Anyone else have any questions? Okay, so I have a couple of questions. Tony, in your study, you found that after 7 months out of school, the children have retained more learning. So what would you want to talk a little bit about what you think contributed to these results? I know you mentioned a few things in your implications, but do you want to summarize for us what you think may have contributed to the children in the tablet group retaining more learning after being out of school for 7 months? I know we weren't sure if we'd see any learning retention after being out of school for 7 months. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, thank you, Karen. I think as we look at the impact, we also need to be mindful of the context in which this intervention was being done. If we look at the study Nikki was talking about, comparing Malawi and UK, we had the higher effect sizes for Malawi than for UK. Now that tells us something. If we're using these in low resource context, the impact is higher than when we're looking at this in the higher resourced context. So I'll give you an example of Malawi. The education system faces a number of challenges. We have challenges with large class sizes. Individualized instruction is non-existent, just not possible. You are looking at the problem of teacher quality. We have a mix of teachers trained through different projects in the system. That creates a lot of variation in the delivery from the teachers. And then you have the challenges of lack of teaching and learning materials in the schools. Teachers are not as able to illustrate the lessons that they're actually doing. Now, if I just look at those three problems and look at what the tablet is able to do, you are directly mitigating those key problems. Children are receiving individualized instruction at their own pace. You have a wealth of illustration materials within the tablet that illustrates those lessons very well. And the use of the integrated digital teacher kind of evens out. Bethany was talking about simulating a teacher as it would be in a good context. Now, when you look at those three variables, they are actually addressing particular challenges in the low-resourced context. And in my view, that explains much of the impact that we're seeing in a context like Malawi. Thank you.
If I could just follow up on that, I think the point Tony made about the effect size being lower in the UK, it is a really important one, and it's still a significant effect of the intervention. But in the UK, we would expect to see less variation in teacher quality and in school resources and class sizes. We've got much smaller class sizes in the UK. So the lower effect size that we saw there is probably because the control group will have received sort of higher quality education in the UK than they would have received in Malawi, or at least less variable. So I think looking at those contextual factors in terms of retention is really fascinating. And to me, it just suggests that this is a way of deep learning. If children can retain those learning gains after 7 months of being outside of a school system, where you're not actively building on those skills, I think that this shows that this sort of technology is a way of children really learning at a conceptual level and not just rote learning. Thank you.
And very different from the typical learning loss that we hear about in other contexts, even just after being out of school for 2 or 3 summer months. So learning retention after 7 months out of school, very impressive. Beth, I wanted to ask you, what would you say were the most important, what would you say from your study were the most important contextual factors that influence children's ability to learn in these remote communities?
It's hard because I feel really attached to all 4 of them now, and like they're all really important. I don't think really any will work I don't think it would work if any of the 4 were dramatically missing. But I think something that I learned from doing the research was just how important the is it sensitization? I don't know if that's the right word, but it is going in, because I feel like I heard a lot about how they were kind of thrown in the deep end a little bit, like they knew X Prize were coming, they knew what was happening, but they didn't get it explained to them in the way that perhaps they should have done, in the detail they should have done, going into the communities, you know, sort of maybe doing a demonstration, all things that cost a huge amount of money, and it is a huge deal to address. But I think that would have maybe prevented some of the teething problems they had early on, where people weren't really knowing what's going on, weren't very certain about why these were here, what they are, what they do, are they spying on me, that kind of thing. I think if it was all introduced to them in a much more structured, maybe filtered down way from the beginning over a long period of time, it would cost more money, but I really think it would have made a huge impact to how they were received within the villages, and, you know, how everyone came together to appreciate them.
Thank you. And Nikki, I was wondering, well, I'll open this to everybody. What additional recommendations would you make for how to move forward based on the results that we've seen?
I think if this is going to be implemented in different contexts, we need to look very carefully at those contexts and at a system level before we go in, because the work that we've shown is that schools make a difference, in implementation fidelity makes a difference in schools. So if you're putting this kind of technology into schools, we need to look at teachers, we need to look at head teachers, school leadership, and we need to look at school systems. Even if you're going out of school, I think what Beth's work showed was that even with a direct-to-community approach, the communities self-organise. So Beth had examples of some villages organising into little schools, even if that was a village shop that was just opening a table for children to come in a safe environment. So I think we need to look very carefully at the system level and work with that. I think what our studies have shown repeatedly is a consistent effect of the software and the technology. And I think if we're wanting to add to that, we need to look at those other factors that contribute to learning gains. And whatever that system is, whether it's a refugee camp, whether it's a remote village in Tanzania, whether it's a school in the UK or a bilingual school in Brazil, we need to understand what those contextual factors are. And Beth's example of sensitization is a way of showing just how important it is to introduce this kind of technology to that system so that they fully understand what it is and engage with the program appropriately.
Thank you, Nikki. I'll just add to that I think personally, that that's looking at the system, which I think is very important in the context. And I think we can also go deeper, looking at different children and different types of children and different challenges that children have and circumstances and what works for children in different contexts, trying to understand better what works for children who may be struggling to learn to read or do maths, for example. So I think going deep and understand and to improve is also understanding better how we can serve different children better as well. But Tony or Beth, do you have any thoughts about recommendations on how to move forward?
Yep, I would quickly say that it's important to recognize that the use of the technology is not to replace the teachers, but rather to support the teachers, give them what they don't have at the moment, at least in the low resourced context. And so as we move forward, the key issue is to look at how the use of the tablet integrates in what the teachers are doing, so that it enables the teachers to do that which they're not able to do without this technology. So we should look at it as a support system rather than something that's replacing the teachers in the system.
Great. Well, we're pretty much at time. I want to thank everyone for joining. If you have any additional questions that we didn't address, let me check here. And I'll just open it up one last time if there are any questions from the audience. Otherwise, we will wrap up. And if anything comes to mind later on, all of us are happy to address questions. Please feel free to email us. I assume that there will be ways of getting our contact information. So we would love to hear from you and to discuss more. I will just wrap up by saying, across all of these studies, we have seen consistent positive impacts in both in maths and also in literacy. And now our question is, okay, we do think that this can scale globally. And I think the next question is, what's the best way to do that? To scale globally, understanding the context that we're moving into and how to leverage and adapt in those contexts, and also understanding different subgroups of children better as we start taking this more broadly. But it's very, very encouraging results that we have all seen. And so we encourage you to investigate this EdTech solution, and we'd be happy to engage in conversation with anybody who has any further questions. So thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
And thank you to 1 billion for letting us talk about your software.
Yeah, thank you.
Andrew, Nat.
Very nice to see you all.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.